I'm going to start off with a little quote. Defying historic norms, the president's opposing party barely picked up seats and only barely flipped the House during a midterm election that featured a deeply unpopular president, near record low congressional approval, and a poor economy. Now, this in itself is a pretty good sum up, I think, of the results of the last midterm elections. More interestingly is the person who actually spoke these words. His name is John Gibbs, and he was the Republican candidate for the House of Representatives in Michigan, district on the west side of Michigan, near Holland, Michigan, slightly above it. And a little over 2 weeks ago, I was in a small church in Muskegon, Michigan, and this Mr. Gibbs, he was there. He has previously worked for the Trump administration, and he's so conservative that he actually questions whether women should have the right to vote. And Mr. Gibbs was there on a bus tour with the other conservative candidates for the Michigan elections. The state attorney general, the people who wanted to be in the House of Representatives in Washington, the whole lot. They were all there, packed together in a bus, touring through Michigan, hoping to win over votes. And I can tell you now, the experts will know, none of them won. And that is very interesting, because something very odd happened. The Democrats managed actually to win the state legislature in Michigan for the first time since 1984, essentially my lifetime. Same thing happened in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and other states. There was a ballot measure in Michigan, essentially a referendum on whether the state should have the right to abortion, yes or no. The ballot measure passed, and the voters of Michigan think the people in that state actually should have access to abortion. So here we get actually one of the first takeaways, I think, of these midterm elections. Essentially, 2024 has become more coup-proof. There's simply less chance of Trump phoning up to a state and saying, hey, can you find me a couple of votes so it look like I have won? Or can you maybe just simply flip the switch and say that I won the election rather than my opponent? And that's actually touches on one of the most important issues, I think, of these midterm elections. It's not necessarily the most important thing who goes to Washington and who doesn't, and who wins the House and who wins the Senate. It's what happens on the more local level in those states that is really important. And if you're, say, in the camp of democracy, which most journalists, I think, are, there's reason for slight optimism, I think. And this is especially surprising given this big red wave was, of course, predicted. And so therefore, there we have it, a midterm actually full of surprises, and that's why we're here tonight at the John Adams Institute, trying to make sense of these really crazy midterms. We indeed, Tracy already said it, we have a lot to talk about. And I myself, I must admit, I'm struggling a little bit. I'm not entirely sure how to feel about these midterms, how to understand them. So that's why I'm glad we have about 450 people here who we can all either discuss it afterwards and have input from. And the reason I struggle is because, Tracy indeed also mentioned it, I recently wrote a book titled Amerika's Laatste Kans, about the future of democracy in the United States, America's Last Chance. Now, this of course sounds very ominous, America's last chance. What are you talking about? The country will be there, whatever happens in the elections or not, of course. But the theme of the book is really, will the US remain a functional democracy? And that is actually the big struggle, I believe, that the US is currently fighting with itself. And these midterms have been a battle in that constant struggle. So now actually the big question that I'm facing, and again we'll be talking about tonight, is, are they seizing that last chance, or is it slipping away further? So to further understand that and to maybe get more of a grasp on that question, let me give you another few takeaways of these midterm elections. And then I again go back to this Mr. Gibbs, John Gibbs, the Republican candidate from Michigan who lost. Because what he did was very surprising, and the quote I gave you at the beginning actually came from his letter, he published it on Twitter, in which he fairly and squarely conceded, said, I lost the election. Sorry about that, too bad, good luck to my opponent, I wish I would have won, we did a good job. Which is surprising, because when I saw Mr. Gibbs 2 weeks ago in that church in Muskegon, he was saying, the Democrats are trying to steal your vote, the elections will be rigged. So I was preparing actually for Mr. Gibbs to write a letter saying, I'm contesting, I'm refusing to accept these results. Instead, this Trump-endorsed candidate who ran on a ticket of essentially election denying said, well, okay, votes have been counted, I lost, better luck next time. And for me, that is actually the most surprising thing that happened during these midterms. And it also goes to show that secretly the whole strategy of election denial, which many Republicans ran on, is not such a successful strategy. Otherwise, this red wave that we were talking about would have been a lot bigger. And secretly, this is the Trumpism that the Republicans essentially ran on is also not a very good electoral strategy. Because let's face it, Trump has won the presidential election of 2016, we all know that. But ever since, Trumpism has been a losing proposition politically. Trump lost his midterms in 2018, he lost the presidential elections in 2020, and now, after basically trying the same recipe again for the third time, the Republicans have not succeeded as much as they wanted to with that particular recipe. So, what do you see happening? Indeed, the future is opening again. The Republicans, like any normal political party, has to search again, what are we about? What is our strategy? What are our ambitions? Whom do we run with? And that in itself is a sign of dynamism, political dynamism. You see that on the side of the Democrats after these midterms, really looking at like what are the issues that really drew out our kind of voters. But all of a sudden, you also see a sort of opening up, a clearing of the sky, almost you could see. It's not all over yet, of course, but you see the same thing happening on the side of the Republicans. And for a democracy, this is a completely unpartisan standpoint. It's always good if there's dynamism on both sides. Another thing, indeed, Tracy mentioned it, youth vote came out massively. I looked up the numbers. For every one young person voting Republican, there were about 3 voting for the Democrats. So the question is, are we seeing here America's future opening up? Or what are the perspectives of Republicans actually drawing in that young vote that is now really going for the Democrats? What are the possibilities for them of trying to take it to their side? Another short takeaway. Essentially, this was really an election of negative campaigning, trying to smear the other side, making sure that people would be fearful of the other side winning. When it comes to Republicans, essentially running on empty because there wasn't much of a program, it doesn't really work. And again, I think this will inspire the Republicans to really think about, like, we have to have a message. One of the best articles I read on the midterms, you can read it in the New York Times today, and it's also, for me still, of course, a valuable source of reference, written by a man called Sohrab Ahmari, and he said, Republican voters, they understand that the party really doesn't offer anything for them at the moment, especially lower income voters. There's simply not enough gain for them in voting Republican. And I thought that was a very cogent point. So there we are. There's also maybe slightly more gloomy signs. J.D. Vance, one of the politicians I was watching very closely, he was the Senate candidate in Ohio, endorsed by Trump, but more importantly, backed by Silicon Valley money from a man called Peter Thiel. Many of you might know who he is. And he won. He's actually one of the few prominent Trump-endorsed candidates that actually won his election. And this also goes to show there is still an avenue for the really, say, radical republicanism that we've seen Trump develop and other ones take over. So, like I say, it's not over yet. But the good thing is, it is really, I think, again at play. And I think the feeling of relief that Tracy just expressed, and maybe many other people also feel, is not necessarily about this side won, the other side lost, but about the fact that, like I say, the sky seems to be clearing again. Apparently, it's still competitive, there's still things at stake, and things can still flip both one side or the other. So in that sense, yes, the struggle continues. I don't know whether America will seize its last chance, but I think we've seen in these midterm elections, at least, and that is the thing I've taken away after 5 years of being a correspondent based out of Washington, but traveling the country, writing for the Financieele Dagblad and the Groene Amsterdammer. Taken away from America is it is still a country capable of choosing a new future for itself every day. And I think that is something we've seen in these midterm elections. And what those choices are and what direction it will go, that's something we'll be talking about with the great panel that John Adams has selected for this evening, and which will be moderated by Elke Bos van Rosenthal. So let's continue the conversation.
We're good. Thank you all for coming. Let me introduce our first two guests. Laila Frank, who has been covering these midterms and the previous elections for the Groene Amsterdammer as well, and for Dutch radio, and she's a pundit on several talk shows. And Albertine Bloemendaal, welcome, a teacher of American Studies at Radboud University. To start with Casper's last point, how, well, whether this was America's last chance or not, but at least it was a narrow escape with all the election deniers being there. By the way, almost 200 election deniers got into office, but not at very important, not Secretary of State in Arizona or such. How did you look at these midterms? Was it comforting in that sense?
Yes, I think I agree with what Casper said about this. And I was mostly worried that, as you mentioned, secretaries of state and governors in key battleground states would be elected that denied the outcome of the 2020 elections, and in the run-up to the 2024 presidential elections could play a very important role. And I think in the most, well, as you already kind of mentioned, most battleground states that did not happen. I think we're still waiting for Nevada and Arizona Secretary of State, or has that been called already?
No, I think the Secretary of State was called, but the governor is not called yet.
Okay, because last time I checked, also the Secretary of State had not been called yet. So
in that sense, comforting.
Yes.
Assuming
no,
we
absolutely.
all applaud democracy.
Yeah.
Laila, it seems like these were unexpectedly so the most normal elections in the US in ages. Was the pre-written narrative in that sense, democracy is dying? Was it perhaps, no matter how understandable, also a bit too much?
I don't think they were normal elections at all. I think there were a set of conditions that we haven't seen in elections before. First of all, everything you just spoke of, the democracy angle. I don't think that's a narrative that was overtaken. I mean, I think that Casper is very correct if he says maybe it was a strategy for the Republic. I'm not even sure if you said that. Let's rephrase it, but
he could have said
I'm
that.
just putting words into your mouth, whatever.
Let's assume he said that.
No. I don't think we were too frightened of that, because I think it was a real threat, and you don't know what would have happened. I mean, that has been the case all along. It's a situation that never happened before, so we didn't know how it was going to end. So I don't think that was a narrative that was overstated. And there were a couple of other things that were very different. It had never happened before that reproductive rights and women's rights were on the ballot like it was.
No, I mean, as quiet as it was the most normal election. Not the stuff that was on the ballot, but we expected at least some involvement with election deniers at the polls or some unrest, and it didn't.
It didn't happen. I think that's very surprising. Yeah.
What Casper talked about, how the Republicans don't have anything to offer to voters, and we were talking about this at dinner. I think we maybe disagreed a little bit, so jump in. Do the Democrats have anything to offer? Yes, they ran on abortion, but this was running against a Supreme Court decision. They ran against election denying, but that's not a platform. Do you feel that the Democrats had something really to offer instead of being against the other party, which is always easy?
Yeah.
I think they had the general platform to offer. So I was in Florida and Pennsylvania for this election. And if you ask voters there, what are your top 3 issues to go vote this time around? It's always abortion, democracy, and then you get sort of a general democratic line of issues. Climate, now I'm confused with Dutch and English abbreviations, LHBTIQ+, I'm doing this one in Dutch. Issues, climate is a big one, LHBTIQ+. Social security, healthcare. So that's more of the general democratic appeal. I think that would not have been enough if democracy and abortion would not have been on the ballot, to answer it that way.
So in that sense, well, maybe Casper, you can join in, because I had the sense that you felt a little different.
Well, the thing we were disagreeing about earlier on is like, have the Democrats actually something to offer? And I think I agree with what Laila was just saying here. part of the appeal of the of part of the good turnout, for instance, for the Democrats this election has also to do with the fact that Biden is essentially running a pretty popular presidency, which gives people better health care, local investments in infrastructure and all these kind of things. And the silly thing about Biden is actually he never really gets credit for anything. Like, if you look at it historically, this has been the best midterms for a sitting president in 20 years. It's been the best midterms for a Democratic president in, I think, over 30 years. So, by all means, this should have been the moment where everybody would say, wow, this Biden, he's a great guy. He manages to do such good midterms for my party. But everybody's like, yeah, well, he's unpopular, so this is despite of Biden. But maybe it's thanks to Biden, or maybe because of this Democrat agenda that Lila pointed out, that's actually very popular with many voters.
Well, that's a good question. In your book, you coin a phrase, I think you call it popularism, right? What not populism, but popularism. You know, the small stuff, but very important to voters. Biden's approval rating obviously is a lot lower than, I mean, the vote was a surprise for everybody because of his approval rating, but do you think the Democrats may have won because of Biden or in spite of Biden? Because that's also a way to explain it.
Well, in that sense, I think a bit of both, in the sense that Biden is just the embodiment of what is the consensus for the Democratic agenda at the moment, and that is carried by a lot of Democrats, but he embodies it, and he has delivered on it, in terms of healthcare, in terms of climate change, in terms of voter rights issues, at least trying to do his best. So, like I said, I mean, there wasn't any other president, so it's a bit of a foil, but yes, I think because of the Democratic agenda that is popular and embodied by the Biden presidency, the Democrats have actually done pretty well this midterms.
I guess my point is, but I'm also just being devil's advocate a little bit, is that Biden has run, or the Democrats have run 2 elections, 2 years ago when Biden won and this one, but it's always against Trump or Trumpism. So it doesn't feel like winning an election on your own, but perhaps you're right and your point is clear. There is a strange situation, Albertina, that we still don't know. We still don't know who's going to win the Senate. I think the Democrats have a slight advantage, but the Republicans may win the Senate as well. They most likely, even though that's not certain, also may win the House. So the Democrats are cheering, but we still may end up in the situation where the Republicans win both the House and the Senate. Is that just a matter of the expectations game, or?
Well, I think it's a result of the expectations game, so to say. Because we were all expecting that red wave that didn't come.
What will it mean for? Because there's been gridlock in Washington, obviously, for years, and no matter what the result will be now, it probably won't change, because either it's if the Democrats win both houses, which is not all too likely, but it'll be a slim majority. When it comes to legislation, what will really change, or what is really at stake in these midterms? Does it really matter which party wins House and Senate?
I think it does matter. I think it will have huge consequences. You mentioned if the Democrats win both the House and the Senate. I think
it's not the most likely scenario.
No, it's. I think they have plans, and they have also campaigned on that. For example, to pass a bill on abortion legislation.
To codify it into law.
Yes, to codify it into law. So. That will be one thing. There is, of course, I think the Electoral Reform Act will try to pass it already before, I think, the new Congress will enter. But I think if only the Republicans only win the House, for example, already, that will be a huge difference. There will all kinds of investigations, and maybe even, hopefully not immediately, but there is a chance of an impeachment attempt, for example, and I do think that chances for gridlock are huge. I did find it hopeful, though, that there seemed to be an increase in split ticket voting in this election.
Yeah, can you explain what that means?
So there has been a decrease in people who vote for a Democrat for one position and a Republican another position, for example, for the Republican senator and the Democratic governor, for example. And what we saw in this election, I think we still have to wait the final outcome and wait until the dust has settled completely. But in Pennsylvania and Georgia, for example, well, I think Georgia may be the most clear case. We saw that, Brian Kemp, the governor, Republican governor, was chosen with quite a bit of a strong majority, so to say, or a bigger majority. And there is a runoff, of course, for the Senate elections between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. And the difference, it seems that not everyone that voted for Brian Kemp also voted for Herschel Walker, for example, which is also hopeful when we look at a question about democracy and election deniers, etc. Because Brian Kemp, of course, was one of the people who was not afraid to confront Donald Trump when he was...
Stand up to Trump.
Yeah,
I always think it's a fascinating phenomenon. Americans that you run into are independent. They're always like very keen on, yeah, I'm very independent. I vote on issues and I vote different down ballot. And then when push comes to shove, it's not such a big number. But this time around, it was especially about the election deniers in governors' positions or in Senate positions, like the real ultra mega candidates that got voted off the ballot, basically. So I'm not sure if it's a real big, huge trend. I think Americans like to brag about it, but it is definitely something that shows you that the big MAGA Republicans were not the favorites this time around.
Also in Pennsylvania, for example.
Right, where the governor, or the candidate for governor lost.
Big, right, yeah.
Yeah. About America's last chance and America's democracy, I got a sense the past days. Now let me phrase it as a question. Is there a danger in overstating the most obvious anti-democratic tendencies, you know, storming the Capitol, which is obvious, and understating the more structural undemocratic norms which make America a very dysfunctional democracy, the electoral college, the gerrymandering, etc. Because we keep warning for a new January 6th, which let's assume that doesn't happen, but the gerrymandering and the structural stuff is still there, and it's hardly being discussed, or at least not enough.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with you. I think it's being discussed among people who care. I think it's a very hard message to get across. From a journalistic point of view, if I say to my editor, I want to do a piece about gerrymandering, they're like, yeah, whatever, that's too complicated.
But that's a problem.
And it's a problem, and I agree with you. So I don't think we've overstated another January 6th. I don't think we've overstated the danger in what could have happened, which didn't happen. I think that's an important entrance, maybe, to broadening the discussion. And I think you see that discussion growing in America. There is now, okay, this is probably going to fail completely, but Andrew Yang, former Democratic candidate, is trying again to create a third political party. You see, it's going to fail. The universe says so.
That's what happens when you say third party. Because
yeah, exactly. No, but I mean, these are all movements towards debating the bigger democratic issues, and I think Americans are warming up to it. I mean, it's not for nothing, I'm not even sure is that English, but that 70% of Americans worry about democracy, and they worry in very different ways. They worry about the influence of money, they worry about gerrymandering, they worry about the electoral system. So I think this is something, and that's what I'm very interested in. I think this is going to be a debate for the next 50 years at least, and I think this is one of the most interesting things about America at this point in time.
Roberta, you want to jump in?
You're on.
You can just
speak. Oh, yes, I have it right here. I think what we're maybe forgetting is what maybe the Republicans forgot in their strategy is they forgot what James Carville always says. It's the economy, stupid. And if the Republicans had followed their original strategy to make it a referendum on Biden, they would have been much more successful. But because Trump inserted himself so clearly, I mean, coming from the summer when they had the Dobbs
the Supreme Court decision, yeah.
Yeah, so then you get up and down, and then you get right up in October, the Republicans were again looking very strong because inflation seemed to be this monster that couldn't be slayed. So then you have that, and then suddenly Trump really inserts himself again, And now you make it a referendum on Trump.
Which is what Biden wanted.
Right, but instead of, Republicans could have their strategy of making a referendum on Biden, because he is so unpopular, even if his policies might have, but that didn't sort of get through. So, but that didn't work in the end, right? It's only a referendum on, and I think that you also, I thought your presentation was very nice, but you're also forgetting that the members of the Republican Party are very, very different today, and Trump brought them into the Republican Party. They used to be members of the Democrat Party. Mm-hmm. And they voted for Obama in 2012, but then when they didn't get hope and change, they want drain the swamp in 2000, just a few years later. And those nearly 9 million something people, and we're mostly in the Rust Belt states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, when they don't get what they want from Obama, and they feel the economic pain or identity pain. What are they going to do? They're going to go to the person who says, I'm going to drain the swamp of the people who didn't, the elites, the anti-establishment, that didn't get you what you want. So, but that's not what the Republicans ran on then. They ran on, or they did run on that, but in the end, Trump inserted himself back into the election, thereby not making a referendum on Democratic policy, but in making a referendum on Trump.
One more thing about Trump before we, I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions as well. What you've been seeing now for the past 2 days, because the Republicans were shell-shocked, obviously, so you see the Murdoch empire, Fox and the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal distancing themselves from Trump. Everybody now jumps on the DeSantis train, obviously, which now seems to be his main rival, even though I guess Trump is still in pole position for the nomination. But he has survived so much. After January 6th, he was unpopular, and then he bounced right back. So I see people feel an urge to now, this was it for Trump. But we've heard that so many times, or not?
I would not underestimate Donald Trump at any time, any given moment. And I think it's interesting. I mean, you see everybody jump off the train and but I think it's so early to draw conclusions on that, to be honest. We all want to, people are looking at DeSantis right now. It's going to take 2 more years for a new election. People who are high up there usually feel miserably after that. We don't know what Trump's going to do. There's all kinds of timing issues with if he wants to run or not. I think it's way too early to say something about it. I would just not write him off yet. I think that would be pretty short-sighted, to be honest.
Okay, let's change the panel. There's so many microphones here tonight. Thank you very much. And Andrew. And we'll move on to the next panel, but again, everybody can and will jump in. Kenneth Manusama, welcome. We already heard you. You teach constitutional law, American constitutional law at Amsterdam University College. Yep. And Andrew Makkinga, presenter and commentator. Tracy already introduced you to. But for a further deep dive into what drove the American voter during these midterms. We've heard abortion, we've heard democracy, the Republicans tried on inflation, tried on crime. Is there one particular thing that for you stood out as maybe the winning, what was the right button to push?
For the Democrats, you mean, the push? I think it was said before that the Democrats were fortunate that Trump cannot help himself and insert himself into the debate. Biden was right to, and the Democrats were right to run against Trump, the figure of Trump in 2020. I think they were right to run against him in 2022. And that is because of the danger to democracy. I'm sensing a sense of relief yesterday. I'm not so sure whether there is relief. Because, of course, because I'm a lawyer, I look at it structurally and I look at what has been going on for the last couple of years. And all the insecurities that are built into the system are still there.
Like gerrymandering.
Like gerrymandering, like the Electoral College was mentioned, the Electoral Count Act, the certification of the procedure for the certification of the presidential results has not been amended yet. Albertina alluded to it. When we have a gridlocked Congress, that's not going to be solved. The voting rights have not been protected in these last 2 years because Biden couldn't get it done, and in a gridlock Congress, it's not going to get done. So we've talked about gerrymandering, but if you talk about voter suppression, about not being able to hand out water to someone who's standing in line to go vote, or when you talk about closing polling stations because states can basically do whatever they want when it comes to federal elections in their own state because of, and I know Andrew and I talked about it a little bit after dinner, 2013 Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court decision said basically racism is over apparently. And Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, said in a different case, we should stop racial discrimination by not discriminating on the basis of race. He basically thinks racism is over. So that struggle, and given all the insecurities that are still in the system, makes the system really, really vulnerable still for Trumpism. And just the final point, and maybe we can get it in later, we were also battling an ideology that is not going away because this ideology of America First, Trumpism we call it now, has been around basically since the 1850s. And this is just the third stage or fourth stage in which we see the same struggle. And that struggle is not going away anytime soon.
Amen.
Which brings us to Andrew.
No, he said everything. I could go home.
No, you cannot, because I know you, and we spoke about this, and I know you. When you look at elections, American elections, you particularly look at trends and voting groups that make you optimistic, right?
Yeah.
What did you watch during these midterms?
Well, what I find optimistic is that I think there's about 8 million new voters on the voting roll. So that's 19 to 27, or 18 to 27, 29. Generation Z. And about 70% of them voted Democratic. And I think that, you know, all the talk about crime and the fear-mongering, actually, that young generation is forcing the Democratic Party to deal with issues as right to choose, to deal with decriminalization of marijuana, to deal with the way people are being treated and racism. And I think that is also a result of what you spoke about. There's a legal aspect to this election that deals with the activism of this third round of a war that's been going on for so long, that like institutions like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been fighting to stop the gerrymandering. And so this is activism that's part of this political struggle, and it's a battle that's ongoing, and a lot of us do not see that. But to bring it back to the younger people, I compare it to, remember you had Beergate with Skip Gates and Obama, you know? So Henry Louis Gates was like this, you know, revered professor, and he gets racially profiled, and then Obama's like, well, I don't know if it, you know, we'll still have to see if racism was involved.
He was just, for context, he was opening his own front door in Harvard, and then he was arrested because they thought a black guy is entering a house.
And Obama, knowing that the Proud Boys were coming down, marching down the lane, had to tiptoe around this sensitivity. Those times are over. I think if you look at the new voters and at the new generation, and of course, the same discussion we have here in Europe, we call it vergrijzing in the Netherlands. I mean, if you wait for all those people to die, where will the rest be? So, and you cannot, it's about, sorry, no disrespect to the boomers, and I love you all, but na vergrijzing, you die.
I look around, this is all Generation Z. I mean,
so the Democratic Party is doing this balancing act between really having to look at the people that forced them and gave them this election, partially, but their narrative, balancing that with the Rust Belt and, you know, the ordinary Joes and the Scranton and, you know, the Joe Biden's friends. So I'm not an expert to say like where this is going, but I find it very inspiring to see that generation that we sometimes speak of as, oh, they're on TikTok, they're not doing that. They actually have found their way to the ballot, and in numbers that are actually very surprising and are growing slowly but surely.
Even the first Generation Z, one second, the first Generation Z exponent being voted into Congress, 25 years old.
Yeah.
Just one thing before, the panel and even the director is so eager to jump in. 1 second. Black Lives Matter. These are the first. Well, I guess 2020. These are the 2020 was the first elections after the whole, the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. These were the second ones, but this was nowhere in the campaign really. You had the defund the police movement a couple of years ago. That was nowhere in this campaign. The Republicans tried to put crime into the conversation, but it obviously didn't really help them.
And they tried
or maybe work the other way. Were you surprised that racial justice was at least not visibly part of this midterm campaign?
No, I'm not surprised at all. That's why I'm very proud. I was born in Uganda, so I'm not an African American, but that's why I'm very proud and inspired by the work of the, like the governance structure, the NAACP, all those young organizers. It's not only in the 60s, you have younger versions of those people walking around in the United States of America. I'm not surprised as a black man because I discussed this with my friends, like the moment we had with George Floyd, even in the Netherlands, like we will never reach a level of global attention as black people again. And the war on Ukraine, the situation in the world now, it always somehow leads to the issue of Black Lives That Matter. It disappears. And I think we need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, why are we normalizing white nationalism? Even in the Netherlands and in Europe, we have normalized people who are like charging into the building on January 6th, and we're introducing them into a political structure and discussing them as if they're part of a normal process, but it is not. And I think that's the dilemma of the United States of America, that white nationalism founded in that settler colony, I mean, we gotta just call it what it was or is, I think is an issue that he addressed. Are we ever going to get rid of it? Do you have the answer? Are we ever going to get rid of that aspect of America?
No, not in a long while. Again, it reminds me of this scene from this TV show called The West Wing, where you have the progressive Toby Ziegler, White House communications director, going to his president, and the president said in a speech, we have abolished discrimination from our hearts, from our laws. Now we have to abolish it from our hearts. And the progressive Toby Ziegler was going like, "What's that mean?" And I thought, well, he's right, but it's the hard part, abolishing discrimination from your hearts. And just something you said, whether we have not seen racial justice issues in this election, we have. There were numerous dog whistles from the Republican side.
Exactly.
Sure, but the Democrats did not campaign on it as loudly as you may have expected.
Because there was an overarching theme on which you can put racial justice, and that is this democracy threat. Because as soon as minority rights are being taken away, that's a sign that your democracy is under attack. So when they talked about crime, all of a sudden, that's a dog whistle. It's law and order from Nixon's time. Everybody is suddenly socialist, communist. That is a huge dog whistle. We've seen that in the 1870s, when after Reconstruction, the black community became more prominent. There were black legislators in the South, and suddenly they were socialists and communists. And Martin Luther King was labeled a communist.
Exactly.
So the slur, so to speak, of being a socialist and a communist is actually a dog whistle.
And then let's not forget that Dr. King wrote a brilliant book, which I advise you all to read, called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, just before he was assassinated. Basically, he spoke about the white liberal and how they tone policed. He didn't call it tone policing, but he was describing that process. But he was also asking that question, where do we go from here? Chaos or is it community? And I think that if you look at that younger demographic, a great deal of those young voters are colored people, black kids. And I think the Republican Party, the white nationalists, they are so scared of black people that they curated Herschel Walker. I mean, let's sit down with that. We're going to have a runoff. And they have this, I don't know, where did they find this guy? But obviously they...
NFL.
This is not a joke. They're pitting two black people. They're fighting it.
But also Herschel Walker, sometimes seen as a bit of a caricature, but this is, I'm going to say something quite blunt, I guess, is that Herschel Walker is the black guy that white people like.
Exactly.
He doesn't come across as too bright, not that well spoken. So if somebody talks about a black person saying he's very articulate, that's actually quite racist. Because the stereotype, the normal black person for a white person, at least in the United States, is not that articulate and talks about in
That's basically how
So this is-
Biden once described Obama during the
Exactly.
campaign, right?
And
Exactly. He's very articulate.
And why did Obama choose Biden? Because Obama knew he wouldn't get through the door if he didn't have somebody like Biden. And Stacey Abrams is like, isn't she from Spelman? She's written like 27 books, so she's so brilliant. But she's too blackety-black, let's just face it. That's why she just lost. But they're going to use her organizing power to make sure Warnock wins, hopefully. But the question is, why are the Republicans pushing in Herschel Walker? The whole runoff, if it's there, shows the importance of the black vote and the importance of black people in the future of America.
And it is not a coincidence that as soon as minorities are basically claiming their rights and their position in society, you get a backlash. You get Trump. You get America First. Those two are connected. Again, 1850s, 1870s, 1950s, 1960s, and ever since Obama was elected. This is not a coincidence. Every time you get 2 steps ahead in terms of progressive policies, expanded rights, you see a backlash. And that is the problem, and that is why you cannot say that democracy is not in danger anymore, or that, as Chief Justice Roberts said, there is no racial discrimination anymore. But you see all this backlash. There was a case before the Supreme Court where basically affirmative action is going to be abolished by the Supreme Court because they also think in the Supreme Court that there's no racism anymore, it's not necessary anymore. This is a constant struggle that is going to live far beyond 2024.
Yeah. Are there questions from the audience, or maybe Tracy?
I'm the audience.
Sorry.
You are.
I'm abusing my position as audience right now. I wanted to come back to something that Andrew said about the important role of young people in this election, and come back to something that was said in the first panel about how little the Democrats really seem to have to offer other than being not Republicans. And I was struck by this recently when Biden announced his legislation to get rid of student debt for hundreds of thousands of people. And I thought, that's wonderful. But at the same time, I could feel that I had this sneaking feeling that he was buying votes. What do you think?
And can I add a question to that?
Yeah,
I'm
Lyle,
sorry,
stand
Andrea.
up.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Y'all entertain yourself.
Is it a one-time thing, this young people's vote? How are they, oh, did I say that? How are they going to make sure that the young people keep coming to vote?
That's a very interesting thing. And that's why you said, was he buying votes? Or was he forced to do it? Because if the reality is that the data shows doing something about student loans is going to hand you these people. Same way, don't ask, don't tell. Oh, should we do it? But then people said, we won't give you no money no more, you Democrats. So are you buying those votes? And that's the thing where the fear for the white nationalists intersects with what you need to do to be a better Democratic Party. I think it's very interesting because it also answers the question, people used to vote, be a Democrat for life. I think the younger generation is far more just looking at issues. Okay, student loan. And it also deals with how do you campaign. So for instance, I was telling Ilko, if you go out as Democrats and you go to all the hoods and you explain to these black communities what the effects of the insulin cap mean, door to door, for those black and brown families, white families.
Insulin,
yeah,
right?
Insulin, yeah. Diabetes, it's an issue. So you have to, I don't think it's buying votes. It's either you do that or you do not survive as a Democratic Party. The question is, if you fail the young people, will they stay home? And that, I don't have the answer to that. It could be that the next round they don't show up, but I would like to be optimistic, and I think that there's something happening that we don't really see, and it could be that there is more engagement. Maybe TikTok is an instrument of political change.
Casper, please.
Well, voting is a habit, and that's why I think Lila's question was very interesting. If young people now go out and vote, and they actually see a result because they've managed to stop a red wave, for instance, or they actually make sure that the president, who does more about climate change, has actually maybe to do more. Yeah. So they get results, and they get grown into this habit of voting.
Exactly.
And especially if you see those ratios, like if I were a Republican and if I see that 3 people vote Democrat and only one of them votes for my party, I'd be worried. And Trump once said, I think one of the smartest things he's ever said is that he was a slip of the tongue, but he makes many. And he said, if every person in this country votes, there won't be a Republican Party anymore, which is true. Which is why it's such a game of trying to prevent people from coming to those polls.
Thank you, Andrew and Kenneth. Let's move and get the... Thank you so much, and I will pick up on that question. Let me reintroduce Roberta Haar at the University of Maastricht, and Casper, who was a student with Roberta.
Yes,
absolutely.
Exactly 20 years ago.
20 years ago. Thanks for being here. You're a foreign policy analyst at the University of Maastricht. We didn't speak about foreign policy. We'll get to that in a second. But briefly, Casper, because it's an interesting point. And if we look at John Fetterman, who again, I think he's 6'5", bald, big guy with a hoodie from a town called Braddock, just outside of Pittsburgh. He won the most expensive Senate race during this cycle, $300 million put into it from both parties. So he's like, I guess with Ron DeSantis, he's the symbol of this election. He's very much Western Pennsylvania, working class, even though he's Harvard educated, but his folks, he's tattooed. He's also the big hope for the Democrats because he may be able to be the one that appeals to, the working class, even though that's a bit of a cliche because, the guy at Starbucks is also working class. But what is your analysis? His voters, the people in Eastern Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, the local issues, how big of a role did it play, for instance, in his campaign?
A very big role, and he had 5 campaign points, and I'll light out one. And he literally phrased it this way and wrote it on his leaflets, saying "Make more shit in America," which is both a sort of rough way of putting it, which is adding to his sort of working class appeal.
Very Trumpian message also.
It's a Trumpian message. Trump said, let's make stuff in America again. The only thing is he never delivered on that agenda, which draws back to the previous point of do you actually get back something from your vote? And I think that is something that drew his voters over the line to a large extent, especially in those steel communities around Pittsburgh, for instance. And yes, I think you're totally right. Why he not necessarily as a person, but what he stands for, could be the future of the Democratic Party, because he manages to appeal to both the latte drinking liberals in big cities and working class people in more rural communities. And the future for Biden is for the one who combines the both, but be it a Republican or be it a Democrat.
And Biden tried, with his Scranton roots that he mentioned it so often. He's from Pennsylvania that you get a little tired of it, but he tried to appeal to both. What Obama never managed to do, even though his mom was from Kansas, Biden really tried hard to appeal to the beer and the wine crowd as well.
Yeah, and did it a little bit, but Fetterman's better.
Yeah. Final question for you, and then we'll go to Roberta. In your book, you write about what wrongs that Obama did, Biden made right, basically, or at least a little bit, right? How he changed the course a bit from the Obama administration that he was a part of. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean?
Yeah, I should if it's in my book, but
or my summary is not right. But I mean, how did he steer leftward a bit from Obama?
I think the thing that went wrong with
Have you read your book?
Not after I've written it. You should never read back too much the thing you've written yourself. It's always painful. No, but like it is what you mentioned. Like the problem with the Obama administration was indeed it opened up the field for the next president, which turned out to be Trump, to say the Democrats are not interested in the forgotten communities in America. They're not interested in bringing back local employment and all these kind of things. And Biden is correcting massively on that. Like he is the president which has done the most over the past maybe 50 years on trying to bring back, say, local industry, infrastructure investments, all these kind of things. I mean, you've been a correspondent. You must have heard the joke Infrastructure Week a bazillion times. I've heard it a bazillion times. It was the week where the infrastructure investments were going to come. They never came. They've happened now. So that is, I think, what you're alluding to. And that is something I think the Democratic voters feel and has also drawn them out in these midterm elections.
Roberta, before we start talking about foreign policy, you've been in the Netherlands for 20 years or so, right? But you're from South Dakota originally. And you have friends and family there, and you've spoken to them.
I'm South Dakotan.
Sorry?
I am South Dakotan.
Right,
Yes,
exactly.
I still very much identify with it.
Yeah, so what did they tell you about what
As a
drove
real
them
American.
in these elections?
Well,
Very
actually,
red state, obviously. But
well, I mean, across the board, all of the candidates in South Dakota are Republican, and
Right.
John Thune is the senator, senior senator from South Dakota, is the minority whip in the Senate, so who may, depending on what happens, become the majority whip. And Mike Rounds, the other senator, is very known for his foreign policy stance. And Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, might very well be the next vice presidential running
very
mate
Trumpian.
to whoever runs for the Republican ticket. This could be very, very possible.
But local issues, as our questioner from the balcony mentioned, was that part of the campaign there? What is your sense? Both for both parties.
Well, Kristi Noem ran on critical race theory, which makes no sense because there's no one in South Dakota teaching critical race theory. But of course,
That says enough, right? I mean, that's nationalizing an issue that's not a matter.
I think Ron DeSantis just did it as well, looking at national issues and saying those things are a problem, and they're a problem here too, but that was a complete misrepresentation of actually what's happening in South Dakota. But there was no way that Kristi Noem was going to lose. But of course, they really want to make sure that they kept the Senate. I mean, I looked at the campaign material that was on my mother's table. My mother's a strong Republican, and a lot of it was quite scary, also with guns. And then Kristi Noem also called abortion rights a pet notion for Democrats, so really undermining the whole idea that people have a legitimate argument to want to not have a forced birth, for example.
And the critical race theory obviously is a dog whistle as well.
Well, dog whistles, I mean, there are hardly
it's too
any.
obvious, right?
In South Dakota, we don't have, we have Native Americans, but we don't have very many blacks in South Dakota.
Right. About foreign policy, because you're specialized in that, and we don't know how Congress is going to look. It may take a few more weeks. Foreign policy was hardly part of this campaign. Maybe if this happened a year ago, the Afghanistan exit or the war in Ukraine, but that was hardly part of this campaign. Would you agree?
No, Ukraine was mentioned, especially by very Trumpy candidates. Even Kevin McCarthy talked about, well, if
a little bit, that they wanted to send a little
they'll
less
stop the
money,
aid,
but
right.
yeah.
So they did. It was part of J.D. Vance that you mentioned. He also said it.
He said, I don't care
But
about
it was
Ukraine.
not a very dominant issue, right?
No, and I think Mitch McConnell was very clear that, and when Ukraine came up in the Congress, Mitch McConnell wanted Biden to spend more. So and I don't think that even if the Republicans gain control of the House, that Ukraine spending will go down. I don't think that's the case.
What would you say, how would you describe the current look from the Republican Party, who still, again, may take over the House and the Senate, looking at foreign policy? It's not the Reagan Party anymore, obviously, more inward, but what would be your analysis?
Well, there are very few things, we talked about polarization often here tonight, but there are very few things that have a bipartisan stance, and I would say Ukraine is one of them, and the other big bipartisan stance is, yes, you're going to mention, is China. And we've also talked about protectionism and make America great again, Trumpy policies, but I would say that Biden has doubled down on those policies much more, even more than Fetterman. I mean, that's part of, a big core part of the big 3 bills that he passed. Whether it's infrastructure, whether it's climate change, or whether it's the CHIPS Act, all these things very much have to be that we'll have supply chains in America, we will have things made in America, and that's why, for the very first time, that Schultz and Macron have got together an agreement. I think they don't get along so well. It's about maybe taking the U.S. to the WTO for protectionism and all these things relate not necessarily to Europe, but to U.S. vision of what it needs to do to compete against China, especially in technology, especially in chips. Right. And maybe I want to come back a little bit to the point that you made, the voices. And maybe it has to do, and this also has to do with China. And I think there are many complex reasons why Americans got to where they were. And some of it has to do with the wealth gap that we've mentioned a little bit, the fact that the wealth gap in America is the same as Brazil today. And the fact that the coastal elite seems to have this condensation or condescension, not condensation, they're condescending, that's the word I want to use, against everybody in the middle of America, including people like in South Dakota. And there's this anger about things happening maybe in the coast and people in the center being left behind. And if you go, whether you're a journalist or whatever, if you go to the middle of South in America, you see a lot of poverty. You see towns, small towns crumbling on Main Street. And all these, so you have that, but then you also have this lack of dignity or where America used to be. Because America used to be the world leader, but now it might be China. So how do you fix that? Well, maybe some people think that Trump might be the answer because people in Washington, and there are a lot of people who are unhappy. I talked about the 9 million before who voted for Obama but felt unhappy about that. In the end, voted for Trump because Trump seemed to give them the answer. But they still don't have the answer. So, yeah, they feel a sense of maybe desperation. But now then you see what happened on January 6th. You see that Trump's really only talking about himself. Then maybe you see a correction and how people are voting. But they still feel like lack of dignity, a lack of knowledge of who they are in the world, and that all comes together and how what they're looking for in the future, whether it's Trump or whoever might come. Hopefully the Democrats can come up with somebody with some new blood.
Right.
The point that Roberta raises is actually very interesting in regards of how this goes forward. Okay, say the Republicans win Congress, or that's Senate or House. It's not going to be very popular, I think, to be obstructionist the coming years because of those things that Roberta mentioned, like the domestic investment agenda, the China agenda. Like those are the bipartisan issues. If Republican Congress is going to block those parts of the Biden administration, it's not going to do them very good favors in 2024.
But I mean, didn't you see the same when Obamacare came about? That should have been in everybody's interest, but they were still obstructing.
Yeah, true.
I mean, again, you spent a lot of time you traveled throughout the country for 5 years, and some Democrats have basically given up on the working class, even though I don't like that phrase, and they wouldn't say so, but they think, these voters are in the Republican camp forever and will be forever. Reading your book, I think you met a lot of people in Beaver County, Western Pennsylvania, who may come back to the Democrats. Yeah. But what will it take besides a guy as John Fetterman? But what else?
Well, I looked up the numbers for these midterm elections. If you look at the lowest bracket of income, 52% vote Democrat, and means the rest of probably voted Republican or did not vote, which means the lower strata of the American social economic ladder is really at play. Like, it could go both ways. And I think what it takes is a candidate, and in that sense, I think actually potentially the Republicans have actually a better case to make to those voters, because many of them also tend to be socially quite conservative. And I think the future is for the candidate that manages to combine, say, the economic interests of those lower strata, and also appeals to the more, say, social conservative issues that those voters are interested in. And there's a group within the Republican Party that really wants to draw the party in that direction.
Economic populism and social conservatism.
Exactly. That is a winning strategy for them, but it is not materializing because the Republicans are also still the party of big corporate interests. So that is a clash within that party, and it's interesting to see how that's going to resolve over the coming years. Mm-hmm.
And how do you place, because we've been talking about Ron DeSantis quite a bit, how do you place Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who seems to touch all the right buttons right now? Would you consider him an economic populist in that sense?
Yeah, and they call it working class conservatism, and and the people who drive this agenda definitely see DeSantis as their figurehead. The only thing I don't know, but maybe other people have thoughts on that. Like, I don't know how popular he's going to be outside of Florida. Essentially, I don't know. Maybe he just, I don't know, it's too cold for him. I don't know whether I've got no clue. And that's again something interesting that we should be watching.
He seems cold. Albertina, you wanted to say something or not?
Well, I was. Oh, okay. I think the Democratic Party also kind of neglected working class voters, certain working class voters to a certain extent, by focusing more on identity politics, for example. That is not necessarily very popular among certain groups of working class voters. And I think we should particularly since the 2016 elections, also with Hillary Clinton, who also kind of tried to bypass Bernie Sanders via that route, who focused more on the class issues and ignored that group of voters somewhat. And I feel like Democratic Party hasn't really tried to appeal to them. And I think that in the midterms, we also saw that they lost some extra working class voters, particularly from non-white groups, who also, well, they're not really appealed to, I think. I think the Democratic Party could do more in its campaign to speak to these voters in that sense.
My favorite story comes from Thomas Frank's book. I think you spoke to him for your book as well. He was a very good writer, and he writes about how Hillary Clinton during the 2016 convention keeps, pushing the unions, and the unions get on stage, etc. And then they cut a deal with Uber, which drove the taxi union obviously crazy, to get all the convention guests with Uber to their hotels.
Yeah. Although this election, again, in Michigan, they also did the research. Most of the voters who were in part of union family, so to speak, who had one family member as part of a union, they all voted, the vast majority voted Democrat. And this is the reason why, because the unions still are an organizing political factor, which explains also why the Republicans are so dead against unionism. Not necessarily because they dislike organized labor, they just dislike the fact that it's a mobilizing political factor for the other side.
Yeah. Kenneth, you wanted to jump in.
I wanted to add, because we're actually talk about forgotten communities in this conversation. And I think what you saw, for instance, on January 6th, were not working class people. Those were often well-to-do middle-class people. And you had the boat parade, the Trump boat parade. You had the DeSantis boat parades. I don't think working-class people have those boats. So there is this core of middle-class people who have become very, very Trumpy, so to speak. And you have to ask yourself, why are they so Trumpy? And I mean, I don't want to get back to, again, the whole racism thing, but it seems to me that we're not talking about why were they so adamant for Trump, where it might not even be in their interest. He didn't offer a middle-class tax cut. Tax cuts only went to the wealthy, for instance. So we're always talking about we have to get to the working class. And I think, Roberto, you said 9 million people went from Obama to Trump. Trump got 74 million votes. So the question is, where are all these other voters? And a lot of them are middle-class voters. And I'm struggling well, I'm not. I want to formulate why do they vote Trump? That's my question. And I'm afraid I keep coming back to come to the conclusion that there is this racial element there, and a white nationalism part. But
Andrew.
Again, very, very interesting, and I agree totally. I would like to add on that, and by the way, you mentioned Brazil, which is also very interesting. Brazil has the largest population of black people outside of Africa. And there you also have the Bolsonaro, and the Lula, and the whole, very interesting dynamics. But apart from that, you mentioned the poor people in Middle America, and he spoke about the middle class and voting for Trump and them being unhappy and not knowing where to go. I was wondering, from your position here in the Netherlands, do you see influence on European politics as a result of Trump or what's been going on in America? Because they always say stuff that happens in America, we do it in Europe a few years later with technology and stuff. But I was wondering, how do you look at European politics? There's a lot of, we had elections in Italy, France. Do you see effects of Trumpism, or is that something totally separate?
It often echoes, right? But maybe we see that Bolsonaro, after a couple of days, said, yes, Lula won. I'm hoping that it also has an effect back to the United States, that then he could say, yes, we agree that they, and we have seen that with various places. So no, I think there's an echo. And I guess this 9 million that I was talking about, that was 2012 to 2016, so it wasn't part of the 74 million that voted for Trump. But I think there's a variety of reasons, but I think Trump somehow, and indeed he does appeal to the QAnon believers and the people who are definite I mean, Trump was dog whistling all the time, especially with Obama and where's his birth certificate? That was definitely a big dog. So he is appealing to some racist element, and also through evangelicals, through promising to have, I mean, in the culture wars, it was very bad for the Republicans to have abortion, Roe versus Wade, turned over, because that was one of their big rallying points, a big way to get their voters out. Now they have to turn to other things like gay marriage, or they have to find other things that the culture war has to invigorate people to come out to vote. But I hope that we can have good results. Maybe one other thing I was thinking, we were having this conversation about, are we worried about democracy in America? And I'm thinking, that, and maybe as the real American here, I can say, comfort you a little bit and say, we've been here before. We talked about...
and worse.
Yeah, and we had many more assassinations in the past, and certainly the Civil War has been very evident throughout with the rules, the rules that are in the South that are the Jim Crow rules that are still definitely there. So you had slavery, economic slavery, rather than the actual slavery. So I think America is, and I think Obama had this phrase, right? The arc of history bends forever, or something.
Yeah.
And I think when I was in, when Trump was first voted for, there was lots of anxiety of my students, and what does this mean? And I thought, America's been in a bad place before, but I believe in America. I believe in American resilience. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we see today is that it's people saying, well, we didn't like what happened in January 6th. This is the first election after January 6th, right? So you can see the people were not happy with what happened there. Or again, I do think it's the Carville, it's the economy stupid. All those things are important to them, but at the same time, they also have a civic education. It can be reborn again, and maybe democracy is always, from time to time, put under some stress. Because I'm teaching a course, Introduction to Political Science at Maastricht University, and I have the most students enrolled in it than ever I've had. And they all come to class, and they all, in the lectures, the 100 students there, and they are avidly taking notes, because suddenly democracy means something. Past generations were complacent. We don't need to learn about that. That's done with. But now, they're not complacent. They're concerned about it. They're interested in it. I teach another course in war and world politics, and nobody was taking that again. Who wants to talk about war anymore? Suddenly, you have an invasion, and everybody wants to take the class again. These things are relevant again. So maybe we just need to be replenished in our enthusiasm, in our own resilience, and go out and vote, and go out and build in civic education, do things that build community, and then we can all over the Atlantic help each other.
Well, let's combine that with my final question to Casper. Will polarization ever end? My question to you would have been, where do you find the optimism? We heard it from Roberta. Let's combine those two. How do we go from total polarization to optimism?
Well, that's a very big one. I've been thinking a lot about these midterms for me, and I think for many people have sort of short-circuited the brain a little bit. Because we seem to be, or say the people who are in favor of democracy seem to be a little happy, because there was not a massive Republican red wave based on election denial. But still, they still have won, more or less. So how can you be feeling positive and jubilant about essentially what is a loss? And I think for me, and it's a personal answer, but everybody can have his own thoughts on this, is it goes to show that the future of the Republican Party, and thereby the future of American democracy, is not set in stone. It's not a given that Trump is going to be the candidate. There's going to be a competition. So things are opening up again. And like I say, we see new Democratic candidates emerging. We see Democrats taking over states that they haven't won in many years. Also the other way around, things are flipping. So everything is moving again. And I've come away from the United States with a feeling that everything was more or less stuck, especially due to that polarization. And I think these midterms have shown that it can all open up again a little bit. And where it's going to go, I don't know. That is something we'll be discussing in 2 years' time again when at the next forum here. But that is something I find the optimism, not necessarily on the outcomes, but on the basic processes that seem to have been changing.
Things are fluid.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Closing, thanks for Casper and also to Roberta. Closing remarks. Great.